Let's see, we are doing
Titanic made one of those.
yeah.
Depending on how you look at it.
Well, certainly engineering was one of the failings of the Titanic. No doubt about it. Okay, looks like we're recording, so we're good to go. Today we are in Chapter 3. It is the 9th of September. We were supposed to have started Chapter 3 on Monday, but of course we didn't have class on Monday because I'd forgotten about Labor Day. I always forget about Labor Day. I don't know what I do, but so we have, I don't know, there's a few sections in here that we're going to just kind of move through very quickly concerning engineering ethics. What I really want you to see is the web page that I'm going to show you here about engineering ethics. The first 5 sections of engineering ethics are essentially the things that we're going to look at in the National Society of Professional Engineers webpage. They talk about, in 3.1, they talk about interaction rules, essentially the guidelines for behavior for engineers. They talk about things like etiquette and morals and other things. And then in 3.2, they talk about settling conflicts. When there's a conflict between engineers or a conflict between engineer and client or whatever, there are ways to go about that. There are things to consider. They talk about the moral issues, conceptual issues, application, factual issues, and so on and so on. Then they go on to moral theories in 3.3, and we go through some different kind of almost like scenarios and activities involving morals. How do you make a moral system? How do you make an ethical system? Put together an ethical system. And then in 3.4, they finally get around to ethics in engineering. And they go on to apply this in some different situations in 3.5, especially when it comes to things like money. I think it comes to things like reimbursement and time allotment. 3.6 is the interesting part where we get into the case studies of engineering catastrophes, essentially bad things that happen in engineering because of poor ethics, following of poor ethics. For this chapter, I've given you just one problem, which is the first problem. The first problem is fairly long. I think it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 parts, A through G. They're essentially giving you different engineering scenarios, and they want you to kind of write it out. No, they want you to determine whether so they've got these conflicts between engineers and other things, and they want to know if it's a moral issue, a conceptual issue, an application issue, or a factual issue. So that's the only thing that I'm actually asking you to do in this chapter for the homework. So we do need to go over those 4 types of ethical issues. And those are found at the beginning again, page 61. So let's go through these definitions really quick of different issues. We have the moral issue. And I'm really just going to read the definition here and then we'll talk about it for a second. Moral issue is involved if the issue can be resolved only by making a moral decision. Okay? For example, when automobiles were first introduced on the roads, a moral decision had to be made whether limits should be placed upon their speeds. Okay. So a moral issue is kind of, we're going to decide what is right and what is wrong. Why was it a moral issue when motorists, were out driving super fast? Because they were doing it for fun, but they were putting other people's lives in danger. So it had to be decided that driving fast was wrong and that driving slow was right. So they created a moral standard. They created a right and wrong situation. So when you have a situation where you're either dealing with a right and wrong situation or you're creating a right and wrong situation, that is a moral issue of ethics. Conceptual issues arise when the morality of an action is agreed upon, but there's uncertainty about how it should be codified into clearly defined law, rule, or policy. For example, society has agreed that innocent motorists should be protected from other motorists who go too fast. The concept is what speed is too fast. So we're trying to resolve what is the best way to enforce this moral that we've already decided on. We already decided what is right and what is wrong. Now, how do we decide where to draw the line? How do we decide, the different, just the kind of the numbers, the nuts and bolts of the issue? Conceptual issue. Applications issue result when it is unclear if a particular act violates a law, rule, or policy. So, using the same example, if you have a car that is going too fast because its brakes failed, for example, is that breaking the law? Is that going against the morals, or should there be a rule that stipulates special conditions, right? Factual issues. So factual issues arise when there is uncertainty about morally relevant facts. And I think that one's a little self-explanatory. When things are not known about the situation, you have to make a decision based on a lack of information, or within the context of a lack of information. You have to deal with factual issues. So every time you're faced with some kind of dilemma, some kind of decision that you have to make that is essentially based on ethics, it is important to understand what kind of decision you're making, because making a moral decision, a decision that is a moral issue kind of thing, is a bit more fundamental than making a decision about that involves factual issues, right? If you just don't have all the facts, you're going to make a decision, and you may make a bad decision or a good decision, or somewhere in between, but you're not necessarily going to change the world with that decision. Whereas a moral decision often is changing the world. We're often defining what we do, or we're making a decision based on those definitions. So those four things are what you need to know to do the homework now. You need to understand to do the homework. It's important. It's a very important skill to learn as you go into engineering, because you will encounter all kinds of poor decisions made with poor ethics, poor decisions made with good ethics, good decisions made with good ethics, good decisions made with poor ethics. People who exercise their ethics make decisions of all kinds, and people who don't make decisions of all kinds. So it's important to understand that, so when you come across them, you can understand them better, and also learn to make your own decisions as you mature in the field. So, now I'm going to take us to, I never called, I need to call Hershey. Let's call Hershey. See if they're there. I haven't been there yet.
Maxwell.
Oh, sorry, thanks. How do I say Hershey? Like it was hello? It won't connect anyway. Maxwell Hershey. Maxwell High School. How do I say Hershey? It's not going to connect anyway. No. So anyway, let's take a look at this. We're here at the NSPE, National Society of Professional Engineers again. And many of the societies out there have a section on ethics. I like this one best. I think it's the most general code of ethics for engineers, and most engineers are using it. And you can download this yourself. Download the PDF of the NSPE Code of Ethics for Engineers. And we're just going to kind of go through this a little bit here and there. You don't necessarily need to take notes. I just want you to have an idea that it's here, that it's available. They have over here on the left side, you can see a history of the Code of Ethics and the Engineer's Creed. Let's actually go to the Engineer's Creed really quick. As a professional engineer, I dedicate my professional knowledge and skill to the advancement and betterment of human welfare. I pledge to give the utmost performance, to participate in none but honest enterprise, to live and work according to the laws of man and high standards of professional conduct, to place service before profit, the honor and standing of the profession before personal advantage and the public welfare above all other considerations. In humility with the need for divine guidance, I make this pledge. Sound familiar, doesn't it? It sounds a little bit kind of like the Hippocratic Oath in some ways. It sounds a little bit like oaths that people take when they enter office. And it is equally, if not even more, important. Hippocratic Oath, of course, is important when you're dealing with, individuals' lives. But really, which person has a bigger opportunity to hurt people? The engineer or the doctor? In many cases, it's the engineer. The engineer has a much higher chance, or not necessarily a much higher chance, but a much bigger potential for causing damage to the human race. An engineer's, thing goes wrong, a building can fall, or a ship can sink, or a plane can crash. And there's, hundreds, if not thousands, of lives snuffed out in one instant. Whereas a doctor is usually working on one person at a time. And if they make a mistake, they're usually stopped after that one person, or maybe a couple. But, engineers can cause really catastrophic problems. So this, I think, of all the oaths taken, I think only the oaths of office for like the president, maybe members of Congress, I think only those can be more long-reaching, or more, can have more significance to mankind than this one. And maybe not even those, but probably those. Politicians cause way more deaths than anyone on earth. So. But this is important, and it's not necessarily any kind of oath that you take when you become an engineer, nothing official. Some engineering schools actually do take this oath. At the end of their graduation, they stand up and they read it, and they raise their arm in the square, and they so pledge, and that kind of thing does happen at engineering schools. Not all of them, some of them do. But this is what it's all based on. This is what this Code of Ethics is based on. So that's a good thing to read, I think. At the preamble of this, it says engineering is an important and learned profession. As members of this profession, engineers are expected to exhibit the highest standards of honesty and integrity. Sounds very much like the pledge we just read. Or the creed, rather. Engineering has a direct, vital impact on the quality of life for all people. Accordingly, services provided by engineers require honesty, impartiality, fairness, and equity, must be dedicated to protection of public health, safety, and welfare. Engineers must perform under a standard of professional behavior that requires adherence to the highest principles of ethical conduct. So very similar to the creed. Then they go on to list off the fundamental canons. These are the basic precepts that this Code of Ethics will be framed in. So we have 6 fundamental canons. The first fundamental canon is to hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. The second, to perform services only in areas of their competence. The third, to issue public statements only in an objective and truthful manner. The fourth, to act for each employer or client as faithful agents or trustees. 5, to avoid deceptive acts. 6, to conduct themselves honorably, responsibly, ethically, and lawfully, so as to enhance the honor, reputation, and usefulness of the profession. Now, as you're reading these, you may be thinking, oh, I've known engineers who have not done that, particularly things like being truthful all the time, objective all the time, avoiding deceptive acts doesn't always happen, conducting themselves honorably all the time doesn't always happen, but engineers should be holding themselves and others to these ethics that we're going to look at. We have rules of practice here. I can't remember how many there are. Looks like there's going to be 5 rules of practice, and we'll go through these really quick. Hold paramount safety, health, and welfare of the public. We're reiterating. So, engineer's judgment is overruled under circumstance. If they're overruled, that endanger life or property, they shall notify their employer or client, such as authority may be appropriate. So, we're just giving some details here. You can go down here and you can say, engineers shall not aid or abet the unlawful practice of engineering by a person or a firm. Okay, so there's different examples. They're just kind of giving more detail. And they continue to give more detail for 5 of them. Why not 6 of them? Because I think the last one, 6, is kind of self-explanatory. Then they go through professional obligations. Actually, professional obligations kind of covers 6, if I remember. Yeah, it kind of does cover 6. So the 6th canon is kind of covered here in these ones. But these are just more and more detailed. You can see that they're talking about deceiving. They're talking about conflicts of interest. They're talking about their employers. They're talking about hurting people, possibly, or whatever. I mean, lots and lots of things. They're just giving more and more details on these canons. And they revise these things pretty regularly. You can see here that we have as revised July 2007. When different situations present themselves that aren't specifically addressed and they think that they should be a little bit more addressed in here, then they will come back and revise these every few years. And you can see down at the bottom here we've got just a statement by the executive committee, and these statements, they're talking, in this particular statement, they're talking about a Supreme Court decision in 1978 about competitive bidding, and this is actually an important part of engineering. It's something that a lot of companies do. The government does this all the time, where they go out and they ask 4 or 5 engineering companies to give them a bid for a project, and then they usually choose the lowest bidder, the one who's going to do the job for the least amount of money, which is kind of ridiculous if you think about it. You really don't want to get the engineers that do the cheapest work. You want to do the ones that give the best work. And those two things do not always coincide. And so anyway, they talk about these kinds of things. Engineers and firms may individually refuse to bid for engineering services. You don't have to, even if the government comes to you. Clients are not required to seek bids for engineering services. If a client wants to use a particular engineering firm because they trust them, they like their work, they can. So that you cannot be forced to do that for engineering services. Federal, state, and local laws governing procedures to procure engineering services are not affected and remain in full force and effect. State societies and local chapters free to actively and aggressively seek legislation for professional selection and negotiation. So anyway, they're just going through here saying that you don't have to go through this process that the government often does. And the government still does this quite often. And it doesn't always result in the best things in the world. But there were some people that were saying that you have to give every engineering company a right to bid for this job, and it's just not true. If you want to use a particular engineering firm because you trust them, you like them, you think that they're going to give you the best that they can give you, you can do whatever you want. So, the Code of Ethics And of course, like I said earlier, that is downloadable. They also have a Board of Ethical Review, so if there's a question about ethics in engineering, if somebody's getting sued or if somebody is having their license taken away or something, there's this Board of Review that does this and reviews these cases to make sure that they're handled properly and they're actually following this code of ethics. There are ethics resources here that you can go to. I don't know exactly, I can't remember exactly what they have there, but probably lots of links and white papers and publications. Yeah, I've got lots of stuff. You've got an exam you can take and see if you're a good thing. Yeah, the Order of the Engineer. I don't know what that is. It's an organization sometime. Anyway, and then there's also courses that you can take on demand to learn more about ethics in engineering. So that is ethics in a nutshell. And I really don't want to go into too much more detail about this. What I really want to do, really have engineering ethics videos. I don't get to that many good ones. Some of these are quite old, looks like 2003, 2009. Looks like these things have, these are different scenarios that they put you in to decide what is the right thing to do, what's the ethical thing to do, right? So anyway, those are not bad things to look at, I suppose. But what I would like to do now is to go to the end of chapter 3. And remember that we do have an exam. We will take an exam on Friday. And for those of you not here in North Platte, which is pretty much most of the class, I will send that exam to you. It will be essentially written exam where you're given some things to write about from chapters 1, 2, and 3. It might be the engineering design method. It might be something else, but it's not going to be terribly challenging, I would have to say. I might ask you some questions about ethics, similar to the homework for today, or the things we're going to discuss today. But when you're done, you will send that exam back to me, and I will grade it. I have been receiving homework from people, and that's good. I will also grade all those things, and I'll have an estimate of how you're doing so far in the class. If you're doing the work and take the test, you're probably doing well. Then, one more thing, after we're done with that chapter 1 through 3 exam, we will start our first project on Monday. So I think that I've got everybody's address now, but I will be packaging up kits to send out to you today or tomorrow, and you will get those hopefully by the weekend or by Monday or Tuesday, and then you can start building your first project, which will be a bridge. We'll talk about that on Monday, introduce you to the project and tell you how to get started. So let's move on to chapter 3.6, which are these scenarios that I want to talk about, the case studies in engineering ethics. So the first one is the Challenger explosion, Space Shuttle Challenger. This happened back when I was in junior high school. I'm not sure which year it was, 1986, 1988, 1987, one of those years. While I was in junior high school. And it's kind of an interesting situation. So let's take a look at some stuff here. Challenger Space Shuttle. Go to the explosion. Let's take a gander at the videos here. This is from the History Channel. That in my video. Good. Still. Of course, it's going to be a commercial. How do I get rid of this stupid echo in this room? I got rid of it.
Chevrolet, Buick, GMC, or Cadillac with no limits. So every time you use it, you're not just shopping limits, you're shopping.
It didn't help.
Learn more at buypowercard.com.
86. So I was in 6th grade. You can see that the
followed, sorrow turned to rage as the true causes of the disaster became known. The immediate cause was a white-hot flame that burned through the side of a rocket motor. A puff of smoke is visible here as the burn-through begins. Only seconds later, the hot flare is clearly visible, burning through the side of the rocket motor. Like a blowtorch, the flare burned through the main fuel tank, igniting the liquid oxygen and hydrogen inside in a spectacular explosion. The flare had started at a joint in the rocket motor, joint sealed with rubber O-rings. NASA and its contractors had evidence that the rocket motor O-rings could fail below 53 degrees Fahrenheit. But NASA had already launched shuttles below 53 degrees and gotten away with it.
Just because you got lucky doesn't mean the risk is reduced. And sure enough, the risks are still there. And the statistics buck it.
So we learned something interesting right away in this very short video from the History Channel, that the engineering company, which was called Raytheon, they actually knew that they shouldn't launch at 53 degrees or below. They knew that as a fact. It's written up in the paperwork. But NASA had done it, and they figured if they'd done it once, they could keep doing it. Now, why would they do that? Why would they launch a space shuttle below 50 degrees or 3 degrees if the engineering firms told them that's not a good idea? Why would they do it? Why would the engineering company let them do it? Can we think of reasons, maybe?
Money.
Okay, money. Where's the money involved here?
Deadlines, probably.
Okay, so Raytheon is a multi-billion-dollar space company. They build just about all the rocket boosters for everything we send into space. Those 2 rocket boosters on the side, built by Raytheon. Is it Raytheon? Thiokol. I think they're the same company.
Morton Thiokol?
Yeah, Thiokol.
Yep.
I think they're actually the same company now, but anyway, Raytheon does similar work. But Thiokol is making just a lot of money every time one of these things goes up, because every time one of them goes up, they have to make more, to replace them. And they're actually recyclable. It's one of the good things about them. Those big boosters fall down to Earth and with parachutes, or fall down to the ocean in parachutes, and they go out and retrieve them, and then they refill them with solid fuel and reassemble them. So this is just a constant money-making process for Thiokol, a multi-billion-dollar company in Utah. And they send them out to California, and they send them to Europe, and they send them to South America, and they send them to Florida, and they send them all over the world, these things. So money is a big issue. And it turns out that as they were investigating this, they discovered that there were people high up in the Thiokol structure that had said, okay, launch it, it'll be fine. They weren't engineers. They were pencil pushers and money grubbers. They were business people. And they had, at one time, some of them had been engineers, but they'd forgotten their engineering heritage and become money hoarders instead of engineers. The engineers in the company were complaining that NASA was doing this. They were saying, this is dangerous. You're putting stresses on our equipment that we can't account for. We can't guarantee anything there. The really interesting thing is that as they were investigating this, the government, whenever there's something to investigate, like when 9/11 happened and when this happened and other things happened, anytime something bad happens and the government's involved or in any way, they always put together a committee of experts to investigate the problem. And this committee of experts almost always meets in or around Washington, D.C., in some important building with some important people from Congress there, and they're part of the committee. And they usually meet for weeks and weeks and weeks discussing things, and then they come to a decision. Well, when they put together this group, one of the experts they called in was actually a physicist named Richard Feynman, who was a very famous physicist in the United States. He died recently. Richard Feynman didn't show up to the meeting. And he's kind of an eccentric guy, so they just kind of assumed he was just being Richard, because he's just that way. But after 2 or 3 weeks, they started to wonder what was going on. And he finally showed up. And they said, well, Richard, where have you been? Most of these people knew him personally. And he said, well, where have you guys been? I've been at Thiokol. I've been where this thing started, where this whole problem began, at Thiokol. And then after I went to Thiokol, I went down to Houston, to Mission Control, to see what kind of decisions they made down there. And after that, I went to Florida, where they put these things together and they launched them. And I talked to people down there. And then when I got all the information I needed to make a decision, I came here. And when they were talking in the video about these rubber seals that failed, he's the one that discovered that before anybody in the meeting had actually done anything but drink coffee and eat donuts. And so it's not just a problem with the companies or even just the politicians. Even scientists and engineers and supposed experts that are put on these committees, they propagate these problems because they get into Washington and they're put in a nice comfortable place with stewards that come in and feed them every 30 minutes or every couple of hours and they wait on their beck and call, and they're staying at the most expensive hotels because if you're a government employee and you're working in Washington, D.C., you get to stay at the best hotels in Washington, D.C. for government rates, which are just pittance. I've stayed at some really nice $300, $400 a night hotels in D.C. for $80 a night because I'm a government employee. They live this kind of life and they're living it high and they don't want it to end, and so they just take their time. Same thing happened with the 9/11 committee. They just kind of sat around for months and months on end trying to decide whether or not they wanted, espresso or whatever that morning instead of actually trying to get down to what actually happened. And I'm not sure they actually ever did figure out what actually happened. They just kind of accepted what they thought happened. So the same thing was about to happen with the Challenger space shuttle, where Richard Feynman came in and said, you know what, I've already figured out the problem. You can stop discussing it. And he had actually brought a piece of the rubber from the material back with him. We put it in a glass of ice water and showed them that after you put it in a glass of ice water, it breaks. Like you can literally just try to bend this piece of rubber and it breaks. And that's why you shouldn't launch these things at 53 degrees and below. Because most ice water is much colder than that, but it's not that hard to get down to those temperatures even in Florida, especially on the rocket itself. So the Challenger space shuttle disaster started out as just a technical, it's not a malfunction, it's just a technical specification. We know that we shouldn't launch these things below 53 degrees. Then they started doing it, they started getting away with it, it wasn't anything, no big deal. and then they had a disaster. What was the next space shuttle disaster? We've had two. What happened on the next one?
Explorer? Was it the Explorer?
I don't remember which one it was, but do you remember what happened? Why it? So the next one to explode exploded on re-entry, and exploded on re-entry because of the heat dissipating tiles that are on the bottom of the space shuttle. Some of those tiles always come off in the launching sequence because they're very delicate, they break very easily, but they dissipate heat extremely well. Let me demonstrate this for you with a video.
Columbia.
That's right, it's Columbia. So one of the reasons we have images of space shuttle tiles, so many of the images, is because the Columbia failed. Because the Columbia's tiles failed and they burned up on re-entry. This is what they look like up close. They've all got a number on them. They track each one of these and they test them regularly. But every once in a while there's holes, and so they have to patch them up and put new ones in, right? And you can't even make this stuff in very big pieces. The pieces, you're limited to the size of piece you can make because they're so delicate, they just break very easily. They just glue them on. They glue them on with a very specific type of ceramic kind of glue. And here you can see some damage that is caused by things hitting the tile. This was on the Endeavour. And this just happens all the time. And you can, the material is kind of ceramic-y, foamy material. It's certainly not any kind of metal. But this happens all the time. I mean, you just get damage like this. The problem is that if you get enough damage in one place, the damage can allow in too much heat, and then you get more and more damage. As the space shuttle heats up, it expands, and then it'll pop off a whole bunch of tiles at once. And if you get a whole bunch of tiles popping off at once, then the heat from re-entry will literally just burn right through the space shuttle, and you have damage, I mean, a catastrophic damage. It's just, you're gonna die, you're gonna burn up. Here is a cube of this heat material, and it has been heated till it's glowing hot, several thousand degrees, and you can see that this person is holding it with his hand. This tells you something about this material. This material is quite remarkable. It has extreme ability to absorb heat, but it doesn't conduct heat hardly at all. So you can be right next to it and it's glowing hot, and the heat will not come out of it by touching it. You'll get a little bit of heat from the glow, but by touching it, it doesn't transfer heat very easily at all by touching it. And that's the reason it's on the space shuttle. So the outside of the space shuttle can get piping hot, but the inside of the space shuttle will just remain kind of warmish. That heat does not get transferred through. It'd be great to have these on your house. We do try to put stuff like that on our house, but not nearly so expensive. And this stuff is very delicate. You know, the first storm to come along would break it all up and make a mess. But anyway, the point being is that this again was something that could be prevented, and after they had their first major problem, they did prevent it. How did they prevent it? They started taking pictures of this in space. So while they're in space, this is actually a picture of the bottom of the space shuttle while they're in space. The top of the space shuttle usually always faces the Earth, so you can see the Earth below them here as they're flying over. And they're actually inspecting this. This is what they did after the Challenger space shuttle. They would inspect these to make sure they didn't have any, major tiles missing. And if they did, then they had devised a method for replacing those tiles before they came back in. And not the easiest task in the world, but they never had to do it, so it didn't matter before they mothballed the fleet of space shuttles. Space shuttles have been around. The space shuttles have been around since the 70s when they finally mothballed the fleet. So they went from the 70s all the way up into the 2000s, I don't think they made it into 2000. I don't remember when the last space shuttle flight was. Let's figure that out. So the last shuttle flight was in Atlantis 2011. So it did make it into the 2010, 2011 year.
It was Atlantis.
What's that?
Atlantis.
Yep, the Atlantis was the last one. And hopefully they're going to replace them with something similar. They've been around a long time. The space shuttle computer is so old. It actually has an iron core, which is a type of computer that's not been around for a long time. You don't use it much. But here they have the memory board of it. This is an old, I mean, even this memory board is super old. Everything in here is so old, but it was so reliable. The way that the way the computer was put together is so reliable. They just never replaced it. Oh, look at that again. That's kind of cool. So here is actually one of the modules from the space shuttle computer. I mean, look at all those boards in there and all those chips. That is so, I mean, there's so little power compared to the computers that we could put in there today. You could put the same computer in a much smaller space. So this is kind of the main computer area. Just a humongous beast compared to what we can do today. And all the panels, you know, as it became more and more, as the space shuttle was updated and everything else, the panels became much more modern. They replaced all the controls, but they never really replaced the computer itself. I'm trying to find a really good image of that computer core, which is just intensely gargantuan. Anyway, so point being, so here they actually show a bit of that iron core there. What a beast. These huge capacitors and diodes everywhere. But it was very reliable. So, going back to the space shuttle disasters, it turns out that both of these disasters came from a combination of poor decisions made despite what was going on in the engineering department. The engineering department was recommending one thing, the business was doing another thing, and so we were certainly dealing with moral issues. The government really wanted to make it look like it was not a moral issue. They wanted to make it look like it was a factual issue, like they just didn't have all the facts. They didn't know, or some other thing, right? But it was not that way, and when that was exposed, it was actually a big sore. I mean, it really hurt a lot of people in the government, in NASA in particular. NASA was really pushing for this because in 1986, the space shuttle program, people weren't as excited about it, and they were trying to get people excited about it. That's why they were sending a teacher out into space at that time. They really wanted to, they were trying to give a boost to the space shuttle program, get people interested in NASA again. They actually had a different, I can't remember what the different thing they had going up that year. It was a different scientist going up instead of the teacher, and they pushed the teacher forward so that they'd get kids interested and get kids excited about it. Well, of course, you know, people did get excited about it, just in the wrong way. And there were, you know, just too much political pressure, too much social pressure to get this done. It's definitely a moral dilemma, definitely a moral issue. They, on page 73, they go through a list of questions based on the Challenger space shuttle about just questions that you could ask to try to figure out what went wrong, who was to blame, you know, these are kinds of things that you have to ask yourself and you have to ask your committee when you're faced with working one of these things out. Usually it's not just a very simple cut and dry thing. Usually there are many people that have done many questionable things, and you have to question all those things to decide who made bad ethical decisions and what kind of bad ethical decisions. Were they moral, were they factual, were they one of the others? And then to what extent did they make those decisions? Were they blatantly being unethical, or was it just an unethical decision in a strange situation that, you know, maybe a little bit more understandable that they made that decision, still wasn't a great decision. 3.6.2, they go through an example of a tower collapse. This is not one that I cover usually a lot. I usually go to page 76 in the Kansas City Hyatt Regency walkway collapse. This one is very interesting to me because the engineers designed one thing, and the architect or the foreman that was in charge of building the design decided to change the design to save on materials, to make it simpler to build and to make the materials cheaper. And you can see here that what they've done. I'm going to switch to this overhead projector really quick. Here is the image. Let's see if it's going to turn on here for us. Good. Okay, we'll zoom in a little bit. So this is the design on the left that the engineer made for this this walkway, and you can see that there is a single bolt coming down through here. And then you have these kind of nuts that hold up each walkway. So here's one walkway held up by these two nuts here. Here's the next one held up here. And this was the original design, designed by the engineer. And then we have here the new design, the revised design. Let me see if I'm getting this correct here. Let's see. I'm not. Yeah, that's right. Okay. So in this original design here, you have a load that is they call F for force. So you have this force of F on this walkway. And you have two things that are holding it up, so half of the load is put in each one of these nuts or one of these washers, whatever it is. So you have half F here, half F here. And then you go down again, you have another load here, and you get half F here, and that happens on every level. And that's how the original design was built. That's what those bolts were designed to handle. The problem is that when they came back and built it, when they actually built the thing, they decided to use shorter rods because they were cheaper, and they revised the design so that you have this rod holding up this walkway, and then you build another rod that would go from this walkway to this walkway and hold up the next walkway. The problem with that is that each consecutive walkway is now hanging on this original nut, whereas in this one, only the first walkway is hanging on this nut. And so the nut was not designed to handle the entire force of the walkway and the entire force of the next walkway, which is what it's doing. So instead of having a force of 1/2 F on these, it's F, twice as much force. And that's what caused the design failure. And for each subsequent walkway that's hanging, you get another 1/2 F on that nut. So if there were 3 walkways, you'd have 3 halves F, and so on and so forth. And this is what caused the collapse, was they revised from the original to this next one without calculating and putting in new hardware to make it work. And the way that they explain it over here is, I'm not sure exactly understandable, because they're throwing in names and all these people. It gets a little confusing, but essentially on the left you have the engineer's design, on the right you have the kind of the builder revised design. The engineer never checked to see if they'd done it, and who's to blame? Is the engineer to blame for not checking if they built his design properly? Is it just the builder for changing the design without checking with an engineer? Lots of different things going on there, but they killed, I don't know how many people, quite a few. Hurricane Katrina is a classic one. Everybody wants to blame Hurricane Katrina on, at the time they wanted to blame the federal government for not building levees. Nobody wanted to blame anyone else. They wanted to blame the federal government. Why do they want to blame the federal government? The federal government actually gave money to Louisiana, specifically to New Orleans, to build those levees and to make them higher, to make them stronger, and to make them work better. So who's to blame? Obviously not the federal government. They gave the money. Maybe they didn't check up on it, and then maybe they should have. The federal government almost never checks up on to see if their money is used properly. But who's really to blame? Well, it came out several months after Katrina that the mayor of New Orleans used that money for his own pet projects. He wanted to do this here and that there. And, the levees don't really matter because they're mostly protecting the poor people of New Orleans. And I don't really care about the poor people of New Orleans. But the problem is the poor people of New Orleans are more than half the city. So why didn't we want to blame the mayor of New Orleans? Well, it was politically incorrect to blame a black mayor for doing something wrong. Because he's in the South, and he was one of the first black mayors of New Orleans, and nobody wants to get involved with racial things, because if you say that he's done something wrong, maybe he'll just say, well, you're just being racist. Nobody wanted to get involved in it. So it was politics. Nobody checked up on him. Nobody nobody wanted to cry foul. So it was kind of our own social programming that wouldn't allow us to check up on that. It wouldn't allow us. It's almost anti-racism. And this happens quite a bit in the United States and other places, where we're trying to overcome racism and we go a little bit too far and we don't check on things like engineering. Engineering truly has to be colorblind. You cannot let race or creed or religion or anything else, even if you're dealing with a really obnoxious Russian like I had to. I had to deal with a Russian engineer. Every time you talk to him, it was like going through a hailstorm. But you can't let that deter you, because bigger things are at stake. And this cost lots of lives that didn't necessarily need to end, because we weren't sure if we were supposed to, call the mayor of New Orleans a cheat and a liar and corrupt, because politically it's not very correct. So again, it came down to people making moral decisions that were really questionable. Unfortunately, it's the bane of engineering. Politics and social issues and prejudice is the bane of engineers. They have to deal with it all the time. They have to fight against it all the time. And you have to be aware of it. If you're not aware of it, it can cause you serious troubles. It could end your career. So be aware of it. Be aware of social issues. You have to be cognizant of them. You have to be sensitive to them, but you cannot bow to them. You have to really understand how to work through them and how to see when they're causing troubles for engineering projects. So that's engineering ethics in 50 minutes or less. I will post this video. Make sure you get your homework done and get ready for the exam on Friday. When we come here on Friday, I will have an exam to give to you all, and we will see you then.
Pretty cool classroom in here, huh?
Yeah, this class is always full. This class